Welcome to the 30th Wallenberg Medal and Lecture. I am Siobhan Harlow, Professor Emerita of Epidemiology and Global Public Health, and the chair of the Wallenberg Medal Executive Committee. On the behalf of the committee and the Doña Human Rights Center, I'm delighted to welcome you to this lecture that honors the University of Michigan's most distinguished alumnus, Raoul Wallenberg. First, I would like to acknowledge that we stand on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, the Three Fires people, the Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations. This year, we are going to begin our program with the premiere of a new film about Wallenberg's life and legacy that has been created by UN professors Valadez and Xu with the collaboration of 19 wonderful University of Michigan students. Following the film, we will present the Wallenberg Medal to the 2025 honoree, Vladimir Kara-Murza, who will give the medal lecture, following which we will have about 20 minutes for questions from the audience. As noted in the film, Raoul Wallenberg was born to one of Sweden's most preeminent families, but having been encouraged to study in America by his grandfather, he enrolled here in 1931. He is one of us. Far from the expectations of family and a student of architecture and art, here he was simply Rudy. Although he took full advantage of his time at the university and grew accustomed to America, as he noted in the film, he felt compelled to do something more useful. And as you saw, in time, he left an enormous legacy. Sweden had remained a neutral nation in World War II. And as they said, in 1944, Budapest was home to the last large surviving Jewish population in Europe, as Hungary had aligned with Germany. However, as they showed in March 1944, the Nazis entered Budapest, and all the same restrictions of movement, ghettoization, and deportation of the Jewish population began. Called to assist, Raoul left the safety of Sweden, a promising career, and on July 9th stepped down from the train in Budapest as a Swedish diplomat. As illustrated in the film, during the 6 months from July 44, just 6 months, to January 1945, through his boldness, his defiance, his creativity, and his courage, he's credited with saving 100,000 lives. And yet, he still lost his life in the Soviet Gulag. Wallenberg's steadfast defiance against brutality and injustice and his courage in the defense of human dignity remind us that no matter how formidable the odds, one person can make a difference in our struggle for a more just world. So tonight, as we once again remember Raoul Wallenberg, we honor this historian, journalist, and dissident Russian politician, Mr. Vladimir Kara-Murza, who at great personal peril has dedicated his life to resisting autocracy, condemning the invasion of Ukraine, and courageously fighting for democracy in Russia. So now I would like to welcome to the podium Dr. Lori McCauley, Provost of the University of Michigan, who will introduce Mr. Kara-Murza and present the medal.
Thank you, Siobhan, for your leadership of this really important legacy event for our campus. Good afternoon, and on behalf of the university, welcome to the 30th Wallenberg Medal and Lecture. I want to first extend warm greetings to members of our Board of Regents, executive officers, and deans who are with us today, to the many generous donors whose support makes this evening possible, to our students, faculty, and staff, and to our members of the broader community who've joined us for this, what I'm sure will be truly inspirational event. Events like these don't happen on their own. They're created through vision and sustained by generosity. I'm so grateful to all of those who have nurtured the Wallenberg legacy here at the University of Michigan. Your continued support ensures that we can honor humanitarians who embody courage, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to human dignity. Thank you all. The Wallenberg Medal is administered by the Danya Human Rights Center, housed within our International Institute. The center serves as a vital hub for the study and practice of human rights at Michigan. At the center, students across our campus engage with human rights through coursework, research, and practical experience, preparing to confront the most pressing humanitarian challenges of our time. We are so fortunate to have this vital unit on our campus. Tonight, we honor Vladimir Kara-Murza with the 30th Wallenberg Medal. His life exemplifies moral courage in the face of tyranny. A historian, journalist, and politician, Vladimir Kara-Murza has dedicated his life to the cause of democracy and human rights in Russia. Working alongside the late opposition leader, Boris Nemtsov, he served as a deputy leader of the People's Freedom Party and became a leading voice for democratic reform. His advocacy for accountability through the Magnitsky sanctions, targeting Russian officials responsible for human rights abuses, made him a target. He was poisoned twice and left in a coma. Investigations by Bellingcat, The Insider, and Der Spiegel identified Russia's Federal Security Service as being responsible for these assassination attempts. In April 2022, Kara-Murza was arrested in Moscow for publicly denouncing the invasion of Ukraine and war crimes committed by Russian forces. Following a closed-door trial, he was sentenced to 25 years for high treason and held in solitary confinement at a maximum security prison in Siberia. Even from his prison cell, he continued to write. His columns for the Washington Post earned him the 2024 Pulitzer Prize for commentary. In August of last year, after more than 2 years of imprisonment, he was released as part of the largest East-West prisoner exchange since the Cold War, negotiated by the United States and German governments. Like Raoul Wallenberg before him, Vladimir Kara-Murza has risked everything to defend those who cannot defend themselves. Wallenberg, our alumnus from the class of 1935, saved thousands of Hungarian Jews during the Holocaust by issuing protective passports and creating safe houses in Budapest. He confronted Nazi and Hungarian forces with nothing but his conviction that every human life has infinite worth. Kara-Murza shares that conviction and that courage. It is truly my honor to invite him to join me on the stage.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Can I go? Okay.
And now we are proud to present the 30th Wallenberg Lecture by Vladimir Kara-Murza.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Macaulay, members of the faculty, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. I feel privileged and delighted to be with all of you here this evening, and I'm honored beyond words to be receiving the 2025 Wallenberg Medal. The life of Raoul Wallenberg, so beautifully presented in this film, is testimony to how great a difference individuals can make when they choose to do the right thing, regardless of the consequences. And it is truly humbling to follow in a long line of people previously recognized with this award, people who chose to stand up to injustice and inhumanity, whether in the form of the Holocaust in Nazi Germany, or the Tutsi genocide in Rwanda, of apartheid in South Africa, or of segregation in the United States. My country, Russia, has experienced more than its fair share of injustice and inhumanity. But one of the most hopeful and inspiring lessons from our history is that at any period, however dark the times, however strong the oppression, you would always find people in Russia who are prepared to do the right thing, regardless of the consequences. Among the most remarkable of these people were Soviet dissidents. They were not armed with anything except their word and a sense of inner freedom. They stood up to a mighty totalitarian state with a ruthless machine of repression. And in the end, amazingly, they proved stronger. It all began on Pushkin Square in Moscow on December the 5th, 1965, 60 years ago next month. That day was officially marked in the Soviet Union as Constitution Day. Produced largely as a propaganda document, as a showcase for the supposed superiority of the Soviet communist regime, that constitution contained many nice words about freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of elections, and so on. Of course, not one of these words had any connection to reality. Suffice to say that that constitution was published at the height of Stalin's Great Terror in the 1930s, when the Soviet state was killing, on average, 1,000 of its own citizens every day. And while the scale of the terror had diminished with Stalin's death, the hypocrisy and the unfreedom that were underpinning the Soviet system remained unchanged. So that day, December the 5th, 1965, several dozen people gathered at the foot of the monument to the poet Alexander Pushkin with the slogan, "Respect your own constitution." This was the first opposition demonstration in Moscow in nearly 4 decades. And out of it was born a movement that was unique in the history of civic resistance, in that its protest was not against the laws, but in support of them, demanding that the regime adhere by its own declared set of rules. It was a movement that had no structures, no leaders, no hierarchy, a movement where everyone was united by an unspoken but deeply shared bond, a sense of personal responsibility for what was happening around them, and a refusal to become silent accomplices in the crimes committed by the regime. Over the years that followed, the movement grew both in numbers and in determination. As Andrei Amalrik, a historian and a prominent dissident in his own right, once remarked, and I quote, "The dissenters did something brilliantly simple. In an unfree country, they began to behave like free people, thereby changing the moral climate and the country's prevailing tradition," end of quote. Thousands of people all over the Soviet Union lived as if the repression around them did not exist. They published and passed on samizdat, underground publications produced on a typewriter on thin cigarette paper, novels, poetry, political pamphlets, historical chronicles, philosophical essays. They signed public petitions openly with their names and addresses, exposing the hypocrisy, the repression, and the violence of the communist state. And they continued to go out and demonstrate, knowing that those few minutes on the square could cost them years in prisons, in labor camps, or worst of all, in so-called special psychiatric hospitals. Perhaps the most famous of these demonstrations took place in August 1968. That month, the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia to crush the Prague Spring and end attempts at political and economic liberalization in the communist bloc. As Soviet tanks rolled on the streets of Prague, the Kremlin went to great efforts to put up a propaganda facade of a supposed universal public support in the Soviet Union for that invasion, or brotherly assistance, as it was officially referred to. All over the Soviet Union, factories, universities, trade unions, collective farms, academic institutes, professional organizations held public assemblies to pass resolutions of approval. Soviet newspapers reported that support for the invasion was unanimous. And then one afternoon, that August, 7 people, 7 brave Russians, went out onto Red Square in Moscow in a silent demonstration of protest. The banner they brought with them read, "Za vašu i našu svobodu," for your freedom and ours. They were not there even 5 minutes. They were beaten, arrested, and herded away almost immediately. All of them paid for that act of civic courage with imprisonment, penal colonies, or psychiatric torture. But after what they did, no one could say that there was universal public support in the Soviet Union for the invasion of Czechoslovakia. As Natalia Gorbanevskaya, a poet, a literary editor, and a mother of 2 young children who was a participant in that demonstration, later said, "A nation minus me is no longer an entire nation." The Soviet dissident movement left us many important lessons, but to me, one stands out above all. Through their actions, through their defiance, through their refusal to compromise with evil, Soviet dissidents showed that fear is always a personal choice. Autocratic regimes may seek to instill fear, to rule by fear, to make fear omnipresent and all-permeating. But at the end of the day, it is up to each one of us, up to each individual person, to choose whether or not to be afraid. It was this very personal example of conquering fear that in the end proved fatal for the Soviet system. It was not a quick process. As Amalric wrote in that same essay, inevitably, this revolution in people's minds could not be quick. But once that example of personal victory over fear was shown, there was no going back. The moment of truth came in August 1991, when the top leaders of the Communist Party, the Soviet government, and the KGB attempted a coup d'etat to end the experiments with democratization and go back to the bad old ways. The leaders of that coup had everything at their disposal, or at least they appeared to. They had control of the party and government apparatus, an elaborate system of propaganda, the police, the army, and the all-powerful machine of repression that was the Soviet KGB. And of course they had tanks, which they sent to occupy central Moscow. Russian citizens, Muscovites, who refused to accept that coup, were not armed with anything except their dignity and their determination to defend their freedom, just like the dissidents of old. And so they went into the streets, not a handful as in the 1960s, but in the tens and hundreds of thousands, and literally stood in front of the tanks. And then the tanks stopped and turned away. I was 10 years old when the Russian Democratic Revolution happened. Too young, of course, to participate and to join my father on the barricades by the Moscow White House, but certainly old enough to grasp the lesson of what was happening, that however strong a dictatorship may appear, when enough people are willing to stand up, all that strength becomes meaningless. And that regardless of the circumstances, it is always possible to choose not to be afraid. That lesson became painfully relevant once again when, after a brief time of Russian democracy in the 1990s, a KGB officer came to power and quickly began to rebuild what he viewed as the lost glory of the fallen dictatorship. Independent television networks were taken down or taken over by the state. Opposition parties were barred from elections and thrown out of parliament. Peaceful demonstrations were violently dispersed. And once again, speaking out against the government became a criminal offense. Just as in Soviet times, Putin's regime relies on fear to maintain its power. It seeks to instill fear, to rule by fear, to make fear omnipresent and all-permeating. But also, as in Soviet times, there are people in our country who choose to defy it. One of them was Boris Nemtsov, my mentor, my colleague, my closest friend, godfather to my younger daughter. Boris broke all the usual stereotypes about politics. He always said what he believed. He always did what he had promised. And he always chose to do what was right, not what was expedient or easy. A one-time member of parliament, governor, and deputy prime minister, he had emerged as the leading, most effective, most powerful voice in opposition to Putin's system, leading mass demonstrations against election fraud and against the first war in Ukraine, publicizing government corruption, successfully pushing for biting international sanctions against the crooks and human rights abusers in Putin's entourage. He could not be bought. He could not be scared. He could not be pushed out of the country. And so on the evening of February 27th, 2015, Boris Nemtsov was silenced the only way he could be. Gunned down with 5 bullets in the back as he walked home across a bridge in front of the Kremlin. Freedom is when you're not afraid to tell the truth, Boris once said. He was free and unafraid to the very end. Another man who was free and unafraid, and whom I was also privileged to call my mentor, was Vladimir Bukovsky. A writer, a scientist, a dissenter, a long-time prisoner of conscience who spent almost 12 years in the Soviet Gulag before being expelled in a prisoner exchange in the 1970s, one of the legends of the Soviet dissident movement. Many years ago, early in Putin's rule, a group of us in the Russian opposition nominated Vladimir Bukovsky, the Russian Václav Havel, for president of Russia, to present the starkest possible contrast to a KGB-led regime. Of course, he was barred from the ballot. Opposition candidates in Putin's Russia always are. But I'll never forget one rally that we held during that presidential campaign. It was in Moscow's Mayakovsky Square, where many years ago, Soviet dissidents, including Bukovsky, held public readings of poetry banned by the communist regime. On that day, once again, the square was filled with people who chose to remain free in an unfree country. When the rally was over, a woman came up to Bukovsky and asked him, why did he decide to return to Russia and run for president? Did you really hope to change anything? And he responded, no, of course I don't. But I returned because people are starting to be afraid again. And when people are starting to be afraid, you have to come, stand next to them, and say, here I am. I'm not afraid. I felt goosebumps all over my back as I was listening to his words. And I've thought of them often since that day, but they rang especially strong in February 2022, when Vladimir Putin launched his brutal and unprovoked military assault against Ukraine. That same week, he shut down what remained of independent media in Russia and enacted laws that made it a criminal offense not only to speak out against the war, but even to call it one. State media denounced anybody who disagreed with the invasion as traitors and foreign agents. In those days, fear seemed to be everywhere. In the news, on the streets, in the looks of passers-by, in the very air around us. It was a very deliberate strategy by the Kremlin to terrorize Russian society and to make all those who disagreed with the war either leave the country or fall silent. I knew from the first moment that I would do neither of those things. Because even if I was powerless to change anything, even if I could not stop that all-permeating fear, I knew that I at least would not allow it to be permeated through me. I've always believed that politicians must lead by personal example. What right would I have to call on my fellow Russian citizens to stand up to this dictatorship and to call out its murderous war if I didn't do it myself? How could I tell others that they should not be afraid if I was? And so in those 6 weeks between the start of the war and my own arrest, Bukovsky's words were constantly replaying inside my head. When people are starting to be afraid, you have to come and stand next to them and say, here I am, I'm not afraid. As this war drags on in its 4th year, as Putin's rule enters its 2nd quarter of a century, political repression inside Russia continues in an ever-accelerating spiral. It is a sobering fact that today's Russia holds more political prisoners than the whole of the Soviet Union, which is 15 present-day countries put together, did in the mid-1980s. According to Memorial, Russia's most respected human rights organization and the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, more than 4,500 people are currently held in prisons in Russia on politically motivated charges. And the leading cause of political imprisonment in Russia are continuing protests against the war in Ukraine. These protests take different forms. In the case of Alexei Gorinov, a Moscow municipal councilman, it was calling for a minute of silence at his district council meetings for Ukrainian children killed by Russian bombs. The price for him was 7 years in prison. In the case of Maria Ponomarenko, a journalist from Siberia, he was posting on social media about the deliberate targeting of civilians by the Russian army in Ukraine. The price for her was 6 years in prison. In the case of Arseny Turbin, he was printing out makeshift leaflets criticizing Vladimir Putin and the war in Ukraine and placing them in the mailboxes of his neighbors' apartments. Arseny is Russia's youngest known political prisoner. He was 15 years old when he was arrested and 16 when he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. And the grim list goes on. More names than will be ever possible to mention. As I said at the beginning, I am honored beyond words to be receiving the Wallenberg Medal. But I accept it not only for myself, but on behalf of all political prisoners in Russia, my fellow citizens who had the conscience to distinguish right from wrong and who had the courage to say it out loud. And the monetary part of this award, in its entirety, $10,000, will go to the 30th of October Foundation that my wife Evgenia and I created to provide direct financial support to the families of political prisoners in Russia, focusing in particular on families with young children or elderly parents. Today's Russia is a very dark place. But out of darkness often comes hope. This never-ending flow of political arrests, indictments, and imprisonments in Putin's Russia does, of course, speak to its injustice and inhumanity. But it also shows how many people there are in Russia who are not willing to look the other way and become silent accomplices in the crimes committed by Putin's regime. People who are prepared to do the right thing, regardless of the circumstances. Last month, 3 members of a music group called Stop Time were arrested in St. Petersburg for performing songs by musicians who oppose the Ukraine war and who were labeled by the Kremlin as foreign agents. On their way to the court, in a police paddy wagon, The band's guitarist, Alexander Orlov, proposed to lead singer Diana Loginova, and she accepted. He gave her a makeshift ring that he rolled out of a paper napkin. And sitting in that courtroom, surrounded by armed police guards in black balaclava masks, they were both laughing and smiling. Free people in an unfree country. People who chose not to be afraid. Alexander is 22, Diana is 18. They are the future of Russia, and a septuagenarian dictator in the Kremlin is not. So even amid this current darkness, looking at these kids, I'm filled with hope and optimism about the future of my country. Because as history has shown us, however strong a dictatorship may appear, all that strength becomes meaningless when enough people are willing to stand up. I thank you very much, and I look forward to our conversations with Professor.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephen Ratner. I am the director of the Donia Human Rights Center and also a professor of law at the University of Michigan Law School, where I teach international law. And as the provost mentioned, it's the Donia Human Rights Center that has been housing the Wallenberg Medal for the last several years, and it's been a great privilege for us at the Donia Center to be involved in this wonderful medal and lecture each year. Thank you, Vladimir, for that, for the remarks, for the lecture, for the inspiration. It is our tradition in the medal and lecture every year to invite questions from the audience. We particularly encourage University of Michigan students to take advantage of this special opportunity to pose questions to our medalist. There are microphones in each of the aisles that are located roughly there. And if you're unable to reach a microphone, please raise your hand. We have a few staff members who can bring a microphone to you. Our first question is going to be from, we have a plant for our first question. That is from one of our wonderful Donia Human Rights fellows, one of 36 students who are participating in our undergraduate fellows program for students interested in pursuing a future in human rights. She's also the undergraduate student member of the Wallenberg Medal Executive Committee that is responsible for selecting the medalist. So I'd like to invite Claudia to ask the first question. Claudia Brinks.
Hi, Mr. Kara-Murza. Nice to see you again. My name is Claudia. I'm a senior at the University of Michigan. First, I'd like to thank you for speaking to us today and being such a display of courage as you continue to fight for human rights and for the Russian people. We've seen a wave of young people around the world fighting against corruption and authoritarianism within their own governments. Given the fact that Putin has now been in power for 25 years, there is currently an entire generation who has never known a Russia before Putin. How have you seen young people mobilize and fight against the regime inside Russia, and how important is it for these young people to continue to engage in this fight, even when they have never lived in a country free from Putin's rule?
Thank you so much. Thank you for this question. And I sometimes have to remind myself that somebody from your generation in Russia, they have no other memories except for Vladimir Putin, because he's been in power for so long. We have 3 kids, the oldest one is 19, so their generation, this is the only reality they've ever known, the only reality they've ever existed in. And so, some people may think that this is actually sort of the brainwashed, the corrupted generation, right? Because they've been sort of shaped by this dictatorship. But it is one of the biggest sources of hope to me to see so many young people in Russia who never knew anything except Putin, but who instinctively know that this is wrong, and that things should not be like this, and they're not going to be okay with this, and they will be coming out and speaking out against this, regardless of the cost. And, you know, as I said a few minutes ago, sometimes hope comes out of the darkest tragedy. And one such moment was last year, in February of 2024. I was still in prison in Omsk in Siberia, and I heard from the radio that Alexei Navalny had been murdered in his prison cell in an Arctic penal colony. Of course, they didn't say murdered, they said he quote-unquote died because it's a Russian state radio. But I had no doubts from the first moment. And then a few days later, my lawyer came to visit me, and he confirmed the news. But he also said, "You'll never believe what I just saw." He said, on the way here to see you in prison, he said, "I drove past Main Square in Omsk, where there's a monument to the victims of Soviet-era political repression. You know, those are the monuments that had been installed back in the early 1990s. And he said, literally in just a couple of days, there was a mountain of flowers that appeared around that monument as a tribute to Alexei Navalny. And on the day that his funeral took place in Moscow, the church where the funeral service was held was, of course, totally cordoned off by police, and nobody except the closest family members were allowed to go in. But on the streets and squares around that church, there were tens of thousands of people, mostly young people, mostly your generation, you know, high schoolers, university students, who came out not only to pay their respects, but also to state their civic position. And it was, I couldn't see or hear any of this, but my lawyer told me again on his visit, and he just showed me some of these printouts from social media, and it was so amazing to see these images of tens of thousands of young people filling all the streets, you know, around that church. And many of these people were saying goodbye to their families that morning because they did not know whether or not they'd return home in the evening, right? Because you had police agents and FSB operatives with video cameras, and every name was taken down, every face was recorded, and yet people still felt the need to go. And it was amazing to, again, I couldn't see or hear, but to know of the fact that tens of thousands of people, young people, were chanting, "No to war, Russia without Putin, and Russia will be free," on the streets of Moscow in the year 2024. So when people ask me why and how can I be optimistic about the future of Russia, I'm optimistic because I see the generation of our kids. I see the young generation. You know, when I see these musicians that I just referenced, since they were arrested 2 weeks ago, not a day has gone by without another demonstration or protest or an impromptu musical concert all around Russia of other young musicians who are now coming out in the street to sing the songs now in solidarity with them. And of course they are arrested. But then somebody else comes the next day, and somebody else comes the day after. They will not be able to arrest everybody. And when I look at these kids, at your generation in Russia, I really am filled with hope and optimism about the future of my country, because they are the future.
Thank you very much. Okay, we can move to the microphones. Is there, go ahead. Okay. Yeah, go ahead. If you please introduce yourself and state your affiliation, and please.
Hi, I'm Ethan Sage. I'm a Russian language major here at U of M. I'm a third-year student. And I've been seeing like this very real fragility in democracy, especially, I mean, in America, obviously. And I'm curious about like the future of democracy. We're talking about democracy in Russia. If the movement is able to, I guess, sustain some sort of democratic movement, how do you see the people maintaining that without falling to the same things that we're seeing here?
Are you talking about this country or generally?
Generally. I mean, I know most about Russia and America, so I guess just more curious about the issues that we're seeing in America, like with elections and things like that.
I would say that, you know, one of the things that really helped me when I was in prison was my background and my education as a historian. Because, you know, history is a science as much as chemistry or mathematics or physics, except, you know, those sciences are more about formulae and numbers and so on. Our science is about the logic, the models of development, and laws. History has its own laws, just like physics does. And I think one of the benefits of being a historian is that we can take a step back and look at longer periods of time, not at the news cycle, not at a month or a year or a decade even, but at longer time spans. And if you do that, there's absolutely no doubt that the trends are in a direction of democracy, are in a direction of justice, are in a direction of freedom. That proverbial arc may not bend as fast or as straightforwardly as we'd like, but the direction is unmistakable. There's this very well-known American human rights organization called Freedom House, based in Washington, D.C., that for the past 50 years or more has been presenting this annual index of freedom or unfreedom in the world. And they publish these maps where they mark countries by color, according to whether they're free or not free, and the not free countries are marked with purple. So if you looked at the map of Europe 40 years ago, this was within my lifetime. This is nothing by historical standards. This is like yesterday morning. If you looked at the Freedom House map of Europe, you would see half of Europe painted purple as not free. Half of Europe was living under some kinds of dictatorships, autocracies, authoritarian regimes, and so on. If you fast forward and look at the map of Europe today, you'll only see 2 unfree countries left. That's Russia and Belarus. And so the trend is unmistakable. Yes, the process is not as fast, as straightforward as maybe we would hope or like, but we know we'll get there in the end. And, I'm optimistic about democracy not only in my own country, but, in all countries, because I think as human history has proven beyond any reasonable doubt, this is the best form of government of any known to humanity. And I have absolutely no doubt that the future belongs to democracy. For all the bumps on the road and for all the difficulties we may face, that's what the future is. And no dictators, no Putin, no Xi, no Maduro, nobody will ever be able to stop that.
Okay, thank you. Let's take a question over from this side. If you could just identify yourself and your affiliation.
Hi, thank you so much for all that you do and for speaking with us today. My name is Anya Raman. I'm a sophomore undergraduate hoping to study history and philosophy, politics, and economics. My question is a bit complex, and I'll provide some context for the audience. So, as you know, obviously, in 2013, the Russian government passed a law that has been informally deemed the gay propaganda law. And in recent years, especially in light of the Ukraine war, it's been expanded to prevent the dissemination of any information about LGBTQ+ communities to any Russian, regardless of age. In addition, in 2023, or beginning in 2023, after the Russian Supreme Court banned the quote-unquote international LGBT movement as an extremist organization, although no such organization exists, there have been increasing crackdowns on LGBTQ+ Russians. To my knowledge, according to the Estonian news organization Medusa, the Russian government is creating a database of queer Russians, and politicians have even talked about eliminating them as an extremist threat. But since we have the foreign agents law that you mentioned, and LGBTQ organizations can't really access people in Russia anymore, how do we protect these marginalized communities of Russians, those who are demonized both within and outside Russia, from the increasing repression that they're facing?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. And this is, by the way, a practice that has been really used a lot by the Putin system, where they make up an organization that does not exist. They create it in their minds, they ban it, and then they go after people for alleged association with that organization that only exists in their own minds. And there's now a whole list of groups like that. For example, there's an organization with an amazing name. It's called the Anti-Russian Separatist Organization. They made it up, they banned it, and then anybody they don't like, they say, okay, he or she belongs to that group. And I think, when we talk about protecting the rights of persecuted people everywhere, I think what's really important is international solidarity, speaking out on behalf of all those people who are persecuted, who are imprisoned, who are discriminated against. Because I think one of the things that any dictatorship fears most is international spotlight and international attention. They'd like for all of this to happen, in darkness, that nobody would notice. Hence, of course, the big priority Putin has placed on shutting down and destroying independent media, because they want all of this to be below the radar. But it's important that all of these acts of discrimination, human rights abuse, actually stay above the radar and stay in the spotlight. And I think it's impossible to overestimate how important international solidarities. I mean, I know this from very personal experience, how important it was for me as a political prisoner to know that people are not forgetting, that people are speaking out, that people are advocating. That knowledge alone helped sustain me in that situation. I know it helps today hundreds and hundreds of other political prisoners who are in the same situation as I was. And so I think not letting them sweep these issues under the carpet and speaking out and advocating and standing in solidarity is the most important thing that people can do and the biggest thing the dictatorship fear.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll take a question from this side now.
Hi, my name is Zimri Lesher. I'm a climate science grad student. I was wondering, what do you think I or we, as students living in the US right now, can do to fight the Russian oppression?
Thank you so much for this question. And, you know, I could spend an hour talking about all the different various things, but I'll say just one thing that may seem like something small and not very significant, but actually this is the most powerful and most important thing that can be. Please write to political prisoners. When an authoritarian regime imprisons an opponent, the goal is not just to punish them and to imprison them. It's also to isolate and demoralize and to make, you know, a political prisoner think that everybody has forgotten, that nobody cares. And one of the sort of the most oft used methods of torture, because it is torture under international law, that the Kremlin has been using against political prisoners in Russia is constant solitary confinement. This is how I was held, this is how Alexei Navalny was held, this is how back in the day people like Vladimir Bukovsky and Natan Sharansky and Yuri Orlov were held, constant solitary confinement. It makes you go crazy. This is the point of this. And one of the things that was absolutely life-saving for me were the letters I was receiving from all over Russia, from all over the world, people that I'd never met, that I'd never known, you know, places I've never been to, but people who took time to write even a few words, even a few lines, to express, you know, that solidarity and that support. And I think only somebody who's been in that situation personally can appreciate how much hope and how much warmth and how much light there is in that stack of papers that the prison guard hands you through the feeding slot in your cell door at 4 o'clock every afternoon. There are human rights organizations now that facilitate this process. For example, there's a very well-known Russian human rights organization called OVD Info, and they have a special website, including in the English language, where there's an online form. You can select any political prisoner from a long, long list of people who are on that list. And you can click on his or her name. You get an online form. You can write, you know, what you want in English, and then they have volunteers who will get it translated into Russian, because obviously all the prison letters are censored, so they have to be in the Russian language. But they have volunteers who will do this, who will make sure to get that letter to the recipient. And I always encourage people to choose the not prominent ones, somebody you've never heard of, because they're in the worst situation. And this is only, you know, a few minutes out of a busy day, but it is life-changing. It means the world's of a difference for somebody who's sitting in a cell in solitary confinement in a Siberian prison. It could mean the difference between surviving or not. It could mean the difference between going crazy or not. Please write to political prisoners. This is very, very important.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much. And thank you in particular for the information about how we can access the website to get the information of where they are and who they are. Okay, yes.
Hi, I'm Jesse Lennon. I'm an undergrad student working for political science, and I might give a little bit of a background for this question. So, as I know from history, like every time Russian democracy, like February Revolution, 90s, it's always been snuffed out by another autocratic regime that just seems to not want any democracy. So I just want to be, in my pessimistic opinion, I do not believe that the downfall and death of Putin will completely end Russian autocracy. So how can Russia ensure that a post-Putin democracy can actually flourish instead of turning into another failed experiment down the line?
A fundamental question. Thank you for asking it. So I think the biggest mistake committed in the 1990s that led us to where we are today and that ensured the failure of Russian democracy back then was the fact that there was never a process that lawyers like to call transitional justice, and that is all about transparency and accountability. We know from the experience of any country that has successfully transitioned from dictatorship to democracy that they all have gone through this process. When the archives were opened about all the crimes committed by the former regimes, when the people responsible for these crimes were brought to account, when the state security structures who were perpetrating these crimes were disbanded. And all of these measures were intended to ensure that this evil could never return again. One of the previous honorees of this medal who was shown in the film on the screen, Archbishop Desmond Tutu in South Africa, he headed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That was their format of transitional justice. In Latin American states, after the fall of their military juntas, these were judicial tribunals. In many countries in Central and Eastern Europe, after the collapse of communism, they had the procedures on what is called lustrations, so essentially where they limited people who were associated with past regimes, and especially their security services, from ever coming back to positions of power, to prevent what happened in Russia. None of this took place in Russia to any great extent in the 1990s. There were people, very far-sighted people, including first and foremost Vladimir Bukovsky, whom I mentioned in my remarks. He spent all of 1992 essentially going around every single government office in Moscow, trying to explain to Yeltsin's people that this is important, that archives have to be open, that people have to be brought to account, that the KGB has to be totally disbanded, not just renamed. Galina Starovoytova, who was one of the leaders of the Russian democratic movement, she was a member of parliament from St. Petersburg, and she twice introduced into the Russian parliament a draft lustration law modeled on a law that had already been passed in Czechoslovakia, which limited former regime officials from staying in power. But in the end, all those calls fell on deaf ears because post-Soviet inertia back in the 90s proved stronger than the desire for accountability and transparency. And many of these officials whom Bukovsky tried to persuade to do this, they would just shrug at him and say, this is going to be a witch hunt. What you're calling is going to be a witch hunt. We don't want to do this. And then he looked back at them and said, in that case, the witches will return and start hunting us. And this is exactly what happened when a KGB officer came to power and began to recreate essentially the old dictatorship under a new guise. And so I think that's the biggest mistake that was committed in Russia back in the 1990s. You're absolutely right. The day after Putin's regime is gone, it doesn't mean we'll be, guaranteed a thriving liberal democracy. Of course not. But after the Putin regime is gone, what there will be is a window of opportunity for change, for democratic change. And there will be another window of opportunity to get things right. And we know from history, first of all, that these windows of opportunity open up very swiftly and suddenly in our country. Right? Both the communist regime and the Tsarist regime before it fell in 3 days, literally speaking, and nobody saw it coming. So we know it will come suddenly, and we also know that it will be very brief. These historic windows of opportunity are, by definition, very small and very brief. The real window of opportunity in the early 90s perhaps was closed by late 92, maybe early 93. This was when, the mistake had already been made. And so I think one of the most important things that we as the Russian democratic movement can be doing now is to actually be preparing for that day after Putin, to make sure we have all the roadmaps, all the plans, all the necessary provisions ready to go forward, to go ahead when that time comes. Because we owe it not just to ourselves, frankly, we owe it to the world. Because we know the consequence of the failure of Russian democracy in the 90s. We're living through it today. The largest military conflict in Europe since World War II. This is what Putin's regime has caused. Because the one very clear linkage when it comes to Russia is the linkage between internal repression and external aggression. Whenever a government in our country does not respect the rights and freedoms of its own people, it is not going to respect the borders of other countries. It is not going to abide by the civilized norms of international behavior abroad. So for as long as Russia has an autocratic, repressive, authoritarian regime, that regime is always going to remain a menace, not just to our own people, but to other countries too. And so the only true way to guarantee peace and security, not just for Ukraine, but for Europe as a whole, the only true way to get to that Europe whole, free and at peace that we all want to see is with a democratic Russia. That is the goal, and it is that goal towards which we should be preparing now. Thank you for your question.
Okay, thank you. The line is quite long at both microphones, which is a wonderful thing to see, but unfortunately we're probably not going to have time for all of the questions. So if you could just, each of you, just keep your questions fairly brief. Please, the next person. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Damian Short. I'm not a student here, but I am at Eastern Michigan. I'm studying Russian pacifism during the Russian Civil War. And trying to keep question brief, sorry, but in my research, I've seen sources say that there is not a unified or significant pacifist movement in Russia currently, but just from what I see and imagine, I don't quite buy into that. I was wondering what your thoughts are on the modern pacifist movement inside Russia.
Thank you very much. First of all, I think it's difficult to talk about movements in a dictatorship, when even the smallest act, not just of protest, but simply of truth-telling, will mean that you're sent off to prison for many, many years. I'll just give you just one example. 6 months ago, a man in Moscow named Yuri Kakhovets received a 5-year prison term for responding to an opinion poll question on the street saying that he's against the war in Ukraine. He didn't stand with a placard, he didn't hold a demonstration, he didn't post anything on social media. He was just walking on the street, and there was a questioner, with a microphone or a camera, asking him what he thought of the war. He said what he thought of the war. They've identified who he was, they tracked him down, came to his home, arrested him, and sent him off to prison for 5 years. So in these conditions, it's not possible to talk about any movements. But what we know absolutely for sure is that there are millions of people in Russia who are completely against this illegal war of aggression. And we know this because of these horrendous government statistics of political repression. Not a week goes by without the news of another arrest, another indictment, another sham trial. Memorial, the human rights organization I referenced, they announced last week for the International Day of Political Prisoners, which is on October 30th, they announced the latest statistics that they have, the latest police figures actually, that every day there are 5 new politically motivated criminal cases opened up against Russian citizens. Every day, 5. So as we speak here, 5 more people will go to prison. And so that tells us that, the Kremlin propaganda that tries to persuade everybody that, all Russians love Putin, all Russians support the war. Well, I've always believed that actions speak louder than words. And I think the actions of the Kremlin tell a very different story. Because if they really did have the support that they claim to have, why would they need to keep our society in a state of constant fear and terror, which is what they have been doing? And but the figures we do have, you talked about the pacifist movement during the Civil War. 2 months ago, there was a United Nations report published on human rights in Russia by the country rapporteur. And one of the figures it referenced, which really stuck in my mind, was that more than 50,000 Russian soldiers became conscientious objectors during this full-scale war against Ukraine in these 3.5 years and refused to fight. Many went to prison for it. Many, went into hiding or escaped to other countries. At least one of them was seeking refuge here in the United States. And this past summer, he was sent, along with about 60 other Russian refugees, asylum seekers, sent by the current US administration back to Russia, and 2 of these people were arrested straight from the plane and driven straight to prison. So we know from figures like this, and from these horrendous statistics of repression, there are a lot of people in Russia who are not okay with this, who may not necessarily be pacifist in a sort of the accepted term that is used for. Maybe some people accept war as a necessary evil when it has to happen, like, when in the Second World War, when a country was attacked, people defended their homes, their families, their lands. This is a completely unjustified, illegal war of aggression against a peaceful, sovereign country that posed no threat whatsoever. And so even if they're not pacifist in a sense that maybe you mean it, but there are millions of people who are totally against what is going on in Ukraine now. And Putin knows this. And this is why the apparatus of repression, this is why all the independent media has been closed down. This is why they have to maintain our society in a state of constant terror. Because they know that if there was even a little bit of freedom in Russia today, they would not be able to sustain this war.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I fear that we are at our last question. So the gentleman over here, and maybe the rest of you will be able to ask more bilaterally after our session is over and talk to our speaker. But this will be the last question for the general audience. Go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Kyle. I'm a third-year math major here at the University of Michigan. So I think it's, like as you have spoken to, I think it's a really positive sign that it seems like the sort of consciousness in the Russian populace is sort of growing about the dictatorship and whatnot. But praxeologically, what do you think are sort of concrete steps that should be taken in order to sort of topple the Putin government?
I think that the key to all of this is access to information. So I think one of the most important factors that led to the collapse of the communist dictatorship was the fact that the information blockade was essentially broken by all of these many Western-operated radio stations, like the BBC, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Deutsche Welle, and so on, that were broadcasting on shortwave frequency, literally beaming their signals across the Iron Curtain to reach millions of people inside the Soviet bloc in their own languages, in Russian, in Polish, in Ukrainian, in Latvian, in all the languages that people spoke. And the fact that the Western world back then was helping people behind the Iron Curtain get access to this free, uncensored information, was helping them to see through the lies and the propaganda peddled by the dictatorships. To me, that was one of the deciding factors in delegitimizing the system in the eyes of its own people and eventually leading to its collapse. There was a KGB internal report from the 1970s that was declassified in the 1990s that showed that according to KGB estimates, up to 30 million people in the Soviet Union were regular listeners, regular meaning daily or weekly, listeners of these foreign radio stations. It's 15% of the adult population on average, and in big cities it was much higher than that. And to me there's a direct correlation between those teenagers who were listening to Radio Free Europe or the BBC in the mid-70s and those 30-somethings who went and stood in front of the tanks in Moscow during the coup attempt in August 1991. It may not be a quick correlation, but it's direct, in my view. And I believe this is something that's absolutely fundamental today. And, I have a personal story to prove it. When I was first arrested in April of 2022, I was placed in a cell with 5 other people in a pretrial detention center in Moscow. So 6 people in total, 5 others, me and 5 others. There's this unwritten but faithfully followed rule in the Russian prison system that they're not allowed to hold political prisoners together. I guess they think we'll start a revolution or something, I don't know what. But so I was the only political, and then all the others were regular, normal criminals. Financial fraudsters, drug traders, computer hackers, just sort of an average cross-section of prison population. Just average, people from the street. And when I was brought into that cell, all of them thought about the war in Ukraine, what they were told to think about the war in Ukraine by the television screen that was constantly on in the cell. So I had to get really patient, and I had to start explaining and arguing and talking and arguing again and responding to their questions and so on. After about 3 or 4 weeks, everybody in that cell thought the same of that war as I do. Not because I said anything genius or brilliant, I didn't. I just gave people the facts. And at the end of the day, most people in Russia, just like most people in any other country on this earth, are normal people. Every normal person would prefer peace to war. Every normal person would be horrified at the thought of hospitals and schools being bombed and children being killed and residential areas being wiped from the face of the earth. The problem is, however shocking this may be to people living in a democratic country in the 21st century, a large part of the Russian population is not even aware that this is all happening. Because the moment Putin invaded Ukraine, or the same week I should say, he imposed a total internet, media, online, all kinds of censorship on Russian citizens. And so I think this is key. And I think the most important goal is to reach as many people in Russia with objective and truthful information about what is going on as possible. There are highly professional, courageous Russian language independent media organizations who are doing it. Now most of them are working outside of the country, but they're doing it. They're trying to get these, this truth inside. The big difference between the 1970s and 80s and today is that back then Western countries were helping people inside the Soviet bloc get access to this truthful information. Now, a lot of Western countries are actually helping Putin suppress it, both on the government level, like for example what the US administration has done a few months ago, just completely destroying the whole system of US international broadcasting, including Voice of America. It does not exist anymore. It has been operating since the Second World War. It was finished off in March of this year, and it's no longer there. Same for Radio Free Asia. We don't know how long Radio Free Europe has. It's still operating for now on a reduced skeleton basis. We don't know how long they have. And it isn't just the government. It's the private sector too. In the last 6 months of 2024, the Apple Corporation took down more than 50 VPN services from its Russian App Store because the Putin government had asked them to. And they want to continue making money and doing business in Putin's Russia. And so they took down these systems that allow people to go around the censorship and access independent information and truthful information. They just took them down. So I have to say it's much more difficult to function in these conditions when a lot of people in the West are actually on Putin's side as opposed to on the side of the truth. But again, I have no doubt that we will get there in the end. It may be more difficult and longer than we'd hoped, but we will get there. And the more people in Russia find out the truth, the faster that change will come. Thank you so much, Steve. Thank
you. So with my apologies to those who are still left on the queue, I just want to bring the event to a close by thanking Provost Macaulay, LSNA Dean Rosario Ceballo, and the other deans who are with us, as well as the members of the Wallenberg Committee and our donors. I'd also like to extend a special recognition to Professor Valadez and Shu and the students involved in this remarkable film that started our event this afternoon. The funding for the accessibility was provided by our Disability Equity Office, and we've had our wonderful ASL interpreters, Casey Lundgren and Casey Ann Watson, and thank you. And the Global Projects team and the LSNA advancement staff to help put together a complicated event like this. Of course, I must mention the person within the Wallenberg Medal who makes this all happen, our wonderful lead administrator, Rachel Levy, who we thank for all of her hard work in making this happen. And then finally, just one more thanks again to Vladimir and Yevgenia for your wonderful time with us these 3 days, both in the past and what we're looking forward to tomorrow, are a wonderful highlight of our academic year. We appreciate your generosity in sharing your many, many insights and inspiration with our students. We look forward to a wonderful day tomorrow, and thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you.